The coffee had been sitting on the counter for 40 minutes when Sloane heard the car pull into the driveway. Not just any car. She knew that engine the way she knew her own heartbeat. Low, expensive, deliberate. The kind of car that didn't apologize for taking up space. She didn't move from the kitchen window. Just stood there with both hands wrapped around a mug that had long gone cold, watching the headlights cut through the November rain. Her daughter was asleep upstairs. That was the only thing that mattered right now. Merzan was asleep, and Sloane was going to keep it that way. The doorbell didn't ring. Of course it didn't. Men like Cade Whitmore didn't ring doorbells. They waited. They let the silence do the work for them. Sloane set down the mug, dried her hands on a dish towel, and went to answer it anyway. He looked exactly the same. That was the first thing she registered, which was ridiculous, because it had been 4 years, and 4 years should leave a mark on a person. It had certainly left marks on her. But Cade stood in her doorway like time had agreed not to touch him. Dark coat, jaw sharp enough to cut glass, eyes the color of deep water before a storm. "You shouldn't be here," she said. "I know. I mean it, Cade. You can't just..." "Sloane." He said her name the way he always had, like it was something that required care, like it was breakable. "There's something you need to know." She didn't let him in. She stood in the doorway of her own house in her socked feet and a flannel shirt with a coffee stain on the sleeve. And she made him say it on the porch in the rain like that was a reasonable thing to do. It turned out to be the most important conversation she'd had in 4 years, and she still wasn't sure she was ready for where it led. Sloane had built her coffee shop the same way she'd built everything else after Cade, brick by brick with her own hands, refusing to ask anyone for help she didn't absolutely need. Groundwork opened 3.5 years ago in a converted garage on the east side of Portland, Oregon. Exposed brick, mismatched chairs, a chalkboard menu she rewrote every Monday morning before Marin woke up. The kind of place where regulars came for the oat milk lattes and stayed because Sloane remembered their orders and never once made them feel like an inconvenience. It wasn't glamorous. It was hers. She'd been a nurse before. ICU, 12-hour shifts, the kind of work that peeled back everything soft about a person and showed you exactly what you were made of. She'd loved it, then burned out on it, the way you burned out on anything that asked too much of you for too long. The coffee shop had started as a way to slow down. It had turned into something she was genuinely proud of. Marin was 4 now. She had Sloane's dark hair and Cade's unsettling ability to read a room, and she had no idea her father existed beyond what Sloane had told her. Which was almost nothing, because almost nothing was all Sloane had known how to say. He didn't know about Marin. That was the part Sloane had been carrying for 4 years. Heavy and quiet, and hers alone. She'd told herself it was the right choice. She'd told herself she was protecting her daughter. She'd told herself a lot of things in the dark at 3 in the morning when Marin cried, and Sloane held her and thought about the man she'd walked away from. The man who had said with terrifying calm, "I don't love you. I'm not capable of it. You need to understand that before this goes any further." She'd understood. She'd walked out the next morning. She hadn't looked back, except for all the ways she had. The night she'd left him, it had been raining too. Portland had a habit of doing that, delivering its worst moments in the same weather, like the sky had a flair for the dramatic. She'd been with him for 7 months. Long enough to stop being careful. Long enough to start leaving things at his apartment. A toothbrush, a novel, a pair of reading glasses she kept forgetting to retrieve. Long enough to start thinking the word future without immediately correcting herself. Cade Whitmore was not the kind of man you planned a future with. She'd known that going in. Everyone who moved in his world knew it. He ran one of the most powerful private equity firms on the West Coast, which was the clean version of the story, the version that appeared in business magazines and charity galas. The less clean version was something Sloane had only started understanding around month 4, the meetings that happened after midnight, the men who came and went from his penthouse without making eye contact, the phone calls he took in other rooms, in other languages, in a tone that turned his voice into something she didn't recognize. She hadn't asked. She'd told herself that was wisdom. Later, she'd understood it was fear. Then one night, she'd asked anyway, "Do you actually love me?" It hadn't even been dramatic. She'd just been tired. Tired of wondering. Tired of performing casualness she didn't feel. Tired of watching him look at her with something in his eyes that could have been everything or nothing depending on the light. He'd been quiet for a long time. Long enough that she'd thought maybe the answer was yes. Just difficult to say. No. His voice had been gentle, which was somehow worse. I care about you. I want you safe. But love isn't something I do, Sloane. It's not something I'm capable of anymore. You deserve to know that. She'd nodded. She'd said okay. She'd gone to sleep beside him that night because leaving at midnight felt too theatrical, and in the morning she'd packed her toothbrush and her novel and her reading glasses, and she'd walked out without a scene. She'd found out she was pregnant 3 weeks later. And she'd kept walking. Who told you where I lived? She asked. Cade was standing in her kitchen now. She'd let him in after all, because the rain had started coming down sideways, and she was constitutionally unable to leave a person standing in the cold, even this person, even him. He looked out of place in her kitchen, too large for it, too expensive, like a painting someone had hung in the wrong room. His coat was dripping onto her tile floor. He hadn't taken it off. Your sister, he said. Sloane was going to have words with Becca. She called me, he continued before she could respond. 2 days ago. She didn't ask my permission. She called and she said you were in trouble and she thought I should know. Sloane went very still. What kind of trouble did she say I was in? She said someone came into your shop 3 weeks ago. A man. She said he came back twice. She said you'd told her not to worry about it, and she was worrying about it anyway. The cup of tea Sloane had been about to make sat forgotten on the counter. She turned to face him fully. She had no right. She loves you. His voice was quiet. She thought you needed help, and she knew I could provide it. You can be angry with her later. A pause. Are you in trouble? Sloane looked at him for a long moment. Cade Whitmore at 11:15 on a Thursday night, soaking wet in her kitchen, watching her with those stormwater eyes that had always managed to see too much. I don't know, she said finally. Maybe. The man's name was Terence Voss. He'd first come into groundwork on a Tuesday in October, ordered a black coffee he'd barely touched, and sat for 2 hours watching the room. She'd noticed because she always noticed that was the nurse in her, the habit of reading environments for things that didn't belong. He'd come back Thursday. Same order, same table, same patience. The third time, he'd waited until the shop was nearly empty, walked up to the counter, and slid a photograph across it without saying a word. It was a photo of her father who had died 4 years ago, who had been, as far as Sloane had understood it, a commercial real estate developer with a moderate-sized firm, 2 ex-wives, and a lifelong habit of keeping people at a careful distance. Except apparently that wasn't the whole story. Your father kept records, Terence Voss had said. I need to know where they are. Sloane had looked at the photograph of her father's face and thought about the lockbox her sister Becca had found in his study after the funeral. The one neither of them had been able to open. The one Becca had kept because she couldn't bring herself to throw it away. She hadn't said any of that to Voss. She'd said she had no idea what he was talking about, and she'd asked him to leave, and he'd gone. But the way he'd looked at her on his way out, patient, like he had time, like he'd be back, had stayed with her. 3 weeks of not sleeping well. 3 weeks of checking the locks twice. 3 weeks of telling herself she was probably overreacting. And then Becca called Cade, because Becca had always trusted Cade in a way Sloane had never fully understood, even when Sloane herself had stopped. You need to tell me everything, Cade said. He'd taken off his coat finally. Set it over the back of one of her kitchen chairs like he lived there. She watched him do it and felt something she didn't have a name for, some complicated layering of familiar and wrong that she'd been managing for 4 years, and apparently hadn't gotten any better at. She told him about Voss. All of it, the 3 visits, the photograph, the question about her father's records. When she finished, Cade was quiet for a moment. Your father's name was Robert Calloway. Yes. He didn't just do commercial real estate. Sloane looked at him. What do you know about my father? I knew him, Cade said. Not well, but I knew who he was, and I knew what he'd been involved in, peripherally. For a long time, I didn't know he had a daughter. He paused. 2 daughters, The kitchen felt very small suddenly. The rain was still coming down outside. Upstairs, Marin was still asleep, utterly unaware that her mother's life was currently restructuring itself around a conversation that had started 4 years ago and apparently hadn't finished. "Tell me," Sloane said. He did. It took a long time. Her father had spent the last decade of his life quietly and methodically building a case. Not in the legal sense. He hadn't been law enforcement, hadn't been working with anyone official. He'd just been a man who'd gotten too close to something he couldn't unknow, who'd made the choice that a lot of people in that position didn't make. He'd started writing it down. Names, dates, financial transactions that didn't match their paper explanations. A network of shell companies and laundered investments that ran through 3 states and connected back to a handful of men who sat on boards and attended charity dinners and had never once been questioned about any of it. One of those men had been in business with Cade's firm, not Cade himself, his father. Before Cade had taken over, cleaned it up, restructured everything with the specific focused energy of a man trying to correct someone else's sins. "I didn't know the full extent of what my father had been involved in until 2 years after I took over," Cade said. He was sitting at her kitchen table now. She'd made tea after all. It gave her hands something to do. "When I found out, I started pulling threads. Some of those threads led back to your father's network. By then, he was already gone. You knew him. You knew who he was." Sloane set down her mug. "And then you met me." Something moved across his face. "Yes. Was that?" She stopped, had to breathe through the question before she could say it. "Was that why you were with me? Was I useful to you, somehow?" The silence stretched long enough to make her stomach drop. In the beginning, he said, "I wanted to know if you had access to anything he'd left behind." He didn't look away from her. She hated him a little for that, for being honest when she'd been hoping he'd lie. "I asked someone to introduce us. I thought it would be useful." She pushed back from the table. "Sloane, don't." Her voice came out steady. She was surprised. "Just give me a second." She stood at the kitchen window again. The rain was gentler now, just a soft gray curtain against the glass. She looked at her own reflection, her dark circles, her flannel shirt, the reading glasses she'd pushed up onto her head without noticing. She'd thought she was past this, past him, past the particular ache of being someone's miscalculation. "When did it stop being useful?" she asked. She didn't turn around. She heard him exhale, around month 2, maybe month 3, a pause. "I told you I wasn't capable of love because I believed it. I'd spent a long time making sure it was true. It was easier than the alternative. And the alternative was telling you the truth and finding out that the truth ended things." She turned around. He was watching her the way he'd always watched her, like he was memorizing something, like he was trying to hold still enough that she wouldn't notice how carefully he was paying attention. "The truth would have ended things," she said. "Just so you know. It would have ended things then. I know." He didn't move. "I know that." She didn't tell him about Marin that night. She almost did. Twice she opened her mouth and twice something stopped her. Some old protective instinct. Some need to hold the most important thing in her life at a safe distance from the conversation that was happening in her kitchen. She'd tell him. She knew she would. She wasn't her father. She didn't believe in keeping secrets that belonged to other people. And Marin deserved to exist in her own father's awareness, regardless of what had happened between her parents. But not tonight. Tonight she needed to understand the shape of the problem first. The lockbox. Becca had it. Becca had been keeping it in the back of her hall closet for 4 years, meaning to get it opened, never quite getting around to it. Sloane called her after Cade left, after she'd walked him to the door and stood in the doorway watching his rental car back out of her driveway, after she'd felt the particular silence of a house that had just been visited by someone who still, irritatingly, catastrophically, felt like home. "I know you're angry," Becca said immediately. "We'll get to that." The lockbox Dad left in his study. "You still have it?" A pause. "Yes." "Don't tell anyone. Don't move it. And Becca, lock your own door tonight." She hung up before her sister could ask questions she couldn't answer yet. It took 3 days for Cade's people to identify Terrence Voss. He wasn't just a messenger. He was a fixer, the kind of man employed by people who couldn't afford to have their names attached to requests like find and retrieve sensitive documents. The kind of man who didn't threaten outright, who just showed up and showed up and showed up until you understood the language he was speaking. Sloane understood it now. The network her father had spent 10 years documenting was still operational. Maybe smaller than it had been, maybe more careful, but still running. And somewhere in the process of people starting to look for whatever her father had left behind, Sloane's name had surfaced. She was a thread. They wanted to know if pulling her would lead anywhere. They don't know about the lockbox, Cade told her. They were in his hotel suite. She'd agreed to that only because Marin was at Becca's for the day, and the hotel was neutral ground in a way her kitchen no longer felt. They're operating on the assumption that whatever Robert left behind, if it survived, he would have kept it near the people he trusted most, which means they're watching you and they're watching your sister. And if they find it before we do, they'll destroy it, and anyone who knew where it was. She thought about her father, thought about what kind of man spent 10 years quietly building something he knew might cost him everything. What kind of man calculated that risk and decided the documentation mattered more? She thought he must have been braver than she'd known. She also thought he'd put his daughters in danger from beyond the grave, which was a complicated thing to be angry about. "We need to get to Becca's," she said. Marin was the one who complicated everything, not because of anything she did. She was 4, she was perfect, she was loud. She was currently telling Sloane's sister an extremely detailed story about a caterpillar she'd seen in the backyard, with the kind of narrative intensity that suggested she had inherited more of Sloane than Cade in the storytelling department. Cade came with Sloane to Becca's. He saw Marin before Sloane had a chance to say anything, saw her in the entryway, small and dark-haired, and talking with both hands the way Sloane did when she was excited. Saw her look up at a stranger in her aunt's doorway and tilt her head in a way that was unmistakably a gesture Sloane had spent 4 years watching him make. He went very still. Sloane watched it happen, watched the exact moment the math resolved in his head, watched his face do something she'd never seen it do, lose its composure entirely for about 3 full seconds before he pulled it back. He looked at her. She held his gaze. "Yes," she said, without saying anything. He looked back at Marin. She'd already lost interest in the strangers and gone back to her caterpillar story, 4 years old and utterly unconcerned with the magnitude of what had just shifted in the room. "Cade," Cheka said carefully. "This is Marin." "Hi," Marin said without looking up. "Hi," Cade said. His voice was rough. She'd never heard it rough before. "It's nice to meet you." Sloane made herself breathe. He didn't say anything to her until Marin went down for her nap. They'd found the lockbox. Becca had retrieved it from the hall closet, old leather with a combination mechanism, and Cade had made a phone call, and 20 minutes later one of his people arrived. A quiet woman named Lena who had the case open in under 10 minutes and had the decency to leave without asking about the contents. The contents. Her father's handwriting, dense and careful, in a series of notebooks. A folder of financial documents with post-it flags and colors that made a system she didn't immediately understand. A USB drive. And a letter, addressed to my daughters, in an envelope that had never been opened. She'd had to sit down. They'd photographed everything, organized it, and sent copies to the contact Cade trusted with the kind of legal situation that required a very particular type of attorney. The kind who dealt in financial crime and had relationships with federal investigators. Then Marin had gone down for her nap, and Becca had made a pointed excuse about needing groceries, and Sloane found herself sitting across from Cade at her sister's kitchen table with the letter between them. "You didn't tell me," he said. "No, 4 years." "Yes." He was quiet. She'd expected anger. She'd braced for it, had been bracing for it since the moment she'd watched the math resolve in his face. But he wasn't angry. He looked like a man trying to figure out which part of a very large thing to pick up first. "Was it?" He stopped, started again. "Was it because of what I said? That I didn't love you?" She considered lying, considered a deflection. She was tired of carrying things alone. "Partly," she said, "and partly because I'd just found out you'd had a reason to be with me that had nothing to do with me. I didn't know if anything was real. I didn't know if you'd stay. And I couldn't. She pressed her hand flat against the table. I couldn't let my daughter's first experience of her father be him leaving. Something crossed his face. So you made sure she never had to experience it at all. I thought I was protecting her. You were protecting yourself too. It wasn't an accusation. She'd expected it to sound like one, but it didn't. It sounded like someone saying something true without cruelty, which was almost harder to receive. Yes, she said. I was. He nodded slowly. The kitchen was quiet. Somewhere in the back of the house, she could hear Marin moving in her sleep. That small rustling sound a sleeping child made that mothers cataloged without thinking. The background hum of "she's okay, she's still there." I want to know her, Cade said. Sloane looked at him. I understand if you say no. I understand if you need conditions and time, and a very long conversation that isn't happening today. He met her eyes. But I need you to know that I want to know her, whatever that looks like, whatever it requires. I'm not going to be my father, Sloane. I'm not going to be someone who chooses the wrong things and leaves a mess for other people to clean up. A pause. I spent 4 years trying to clean up his. I'd rather spend the next 4 years differently. She thought about her father's letter, still sitting in the envelope between them. She thought about the man she'd walked away from and the man sitting in front of her now and whether those were the same person anymore. She thought about Marin, asleep in the next room, who had her father's way of reading a room and her mother's stubbornness and an entire life in front of her that Sloane had been building as carefully as she could, but couldn't build completely alone. It would take time, she said finally. I have time, and it would be slow. No rushing anything. Marin comes first, her comfort, her pace. Of course. And you and I. She stopped. Whatever happened between us, whatever this is, that's a separate conversation, a different timeline. You don't get to be her father and have that be a way back to me. Those are two different things. He looked at her steadily. I understand. She believed him. That was the thing that got her, the thing she hadn't expected. She looked at him across her sister's kitchen table, and she believed him, and she didn't know what to do with that except hold it carefully and see what it turned into. Okay, she said. Okay. Terence Voss was arrested on a Tuesday morning. The federal case was moving faster than anyone had expected. Her father's records, it turned out, were meticulous to a degree that almost made Sloane cry when the attorney explained it to her. He'd been doing it for years, quietly, building a case that was already half constructed by the time anyone opened those notebooks. The men whose names appeared in those notebooks were the kind of men who gave speeches about civic responsibility, the kind who had buildings named after them, the kind who had, for decades, operated in the comfortable belief that their distance from the visible parts of their businesses would protect them. Her father had not believed in comfortable assumptions. She read his letter, finally, on a Sunday evening when Marin was in bed, and the coffee shop was closed, and the apartment was quiet enough that she could actually hear herself think. I am sorry for the things I wasn't able to say in person, he'd written. I was not good at closeness. I think you both know that. I told myself it was protection. I understand now that protection and distance are not the same thing, and I caused damage with that confusion that I am not sure I can undo. What I can give you is this, not just the records, the explanation, the truth of why I spent so long looking away from the people in front of me, because I was so focused on documenting the people who needed to be stopped. It was not the right choice. But it was the choice I made. I am trying to make it mean something. Be brave. Be close to the people who deserve it. Don't let fear make your decisions. I love you both more than I knew how to say. That was my failure, not yours. She folded the letter and held it for a long time. Then she wiped her face on her flannel sleeve and went to make herself a cup of tea. 6 months later, Sloane was behind the counter at Groundwork on a Saturday morning when the door opened and Cade came in with Marin on his shoulders. This was not a new thing anymore. Marin had decided, with the efficient pragmatism of a 4-year-old, that Cade was acceptable approximately 3 weeks into knowing him, primarily because he had agreed to read the same picture book about a duck 6 times in a row without complaint. He had been elevated in her estimation steadily since then. Sloane watched them come in, Marin ducking her head dramatically to avoid the doorframe, even though she was nowhere near hitting it, Cade holding her ankles with both hands and navigating the doorway with the careful focus of a man who took his assigned tasks seriously. "Duck!" he said. "I ducked!" Marin said. "The door hasn't moved yet." "Mama!" Marin spotted her. "We got bagels, but Cade said we had to say hi first." "Hi first is the correct order," Sloane agreed. She came around the counter. Cade lowered Marin to the ground with the slightly overcautious manner he still had sometimes, like she was more fragile than she looked, which she wasn't. Marin was extremely not fragile. "Hi," he said to Sloane. "Hi." They weren't whatever they'd been 4 years ago. They weren't nothing either. They were in the process of becoming something she didn't have a word for yet. Something that had been built slowly, carefully, with a lot of conversations and a few difficult evenings, and the shared understanding that they were both trying not to repeat their respective fathers' particular brands of damage. It was imperfect. It was ongoing. It felt, most days, like the most honest thing in her life. She poured him a coffee without asking, black, the way he took it, and slid it across the counter. He looked at the cup, then at her. "You remembered. I remember everyone's order," she said. "It's my superpower." "I know." The corner of his mouth lifted. "I just like hearing you say it." Marin had already climbed into her usual chair and was examining the bagel bag with the focus of a person who had strong opinions about which bagel was hers. Outside the coffee shop windows, Portland was doing what it usually did in May, brief sunshine between clouds, the kind of light that made the wet streets look like they were made of something more valuable than asphalt. Inside, the Saturday regulars were filling the mismatched chairs. The chalkboard menu needed updating. The espresso machine was doing that thing it did sometimes, where the pressure gauge read slightly high, which she'd been meaning to have looked at. Her father's evidence had become a federal case that was going to take another year at least to fully resolve. Terrence Voss had given a name, several names, in exchange for considerations she didn't have the full details of and had decided she didn't need them. Her father's notebooks were evidence now. His careful, patient, decade-long record of everything that was wrong had become the foundation of something that might actually fix it. She'd thought she would feel angrier about him than she did. She thought she'd spent most of her adult life being frustrated by his distance, and now that she understood some of the reason for it, she mostly just felt the shape of the loss more clearly. She missed him. She wished she could tell him she'd read his letter. She wished she could tell him about Marin. She thought he would have loved Marin. She thought he would have been bad at showing it, and Marin would have bulldozed right through that anyway, and it would have been good for both of them. Be close to the people who deserve it. She was working on it. That evening, after the shop closed and Marin had been collected and bathed and read to, and was now deeply, immovably asleep, Sloane sat on her front porch with the last of a cup of tea and watched the neighborhood go quiet. Cade sat down beside her without asking. She'd given him a key 3 weeks ago. Not a dramatic thing. He'd mentioned he sometimes got there before she did and had to wait on the porch in the cold, and she'd handed it over while she was making lunches and told him to stop being dramatic about it. He hadn't said anything at the time, but she'd noticed he kept it somewhere he could find it easily, which she chose not to make a big deal of. "She asleep?" he asked. "Before I finished the last page. She was fighting it hard. She always fights it hard. She has opinions about unconsciousness." He smiled. It still caught her sometimes. The fact that he smiled more now than he had 4 years ago, like something in him had loosened up and hadn't bothered to tighten back. They sat in the quiet for a while. A neighbor's dog barked twice and went still. Somewhere down the block, someone was cooking something with garlic. "I'm sorry," he said eventually. She looked at him. For the beginning, for why I came into your life. I know I've said it before, you have, and I know apologies have diminishing returns, but he stopped. I keep thinking about what you said, that you didn't know if anything was real, and I want you to know that it was. Whatever my reasons were at the start, what I felt was real. What I said was wrong. What I did to protect myself by saying it was wrong." He turned to look at her. "You should have known, before you left. You should have known it was real." Sloane held her mug with both hands and let the warmth travel up through her palms. She'd thought about this. She'd thought about what she wanted from him and what forgiveness actually meant and what it felt like to stop holding something at a careful distance because you were afraid of what happened if you let it close. Her father had written, "Be close to the people who deserve it." "I know it was real," she said finally. "I think I knew it then too. I just didn't know how to trust it." She looked at him. "I'm learning." He didn't say anything. He just reached over and put his hand over hers, where it was wrapped around the mug. His hand was warm. She let him. That was the beginning of the next thing. Not a fairy tale. She didn't have much patience for those. More like two people deciding, consciously and with full awareness of all the ways it could go wrong, to stop letting the past be the loudest voice in the room. More like choosing to be close to someone who had earned it. More like her father's handwriting in a letter that had waited 4 years to be read. "I love you more than I knew how to say." She was getting better at saying it.